Well, hi, welcome to week 2 of our Utilizing Conflict Utilization offered through the Ministry Training Program of Phillips Theological Seminary. This week we are beginning to look at analysis and components of conflict. And I've been really thinking about how to talk about this. And so this is the first of 2 weeks in analysis. We're going to pick up more on how do we analyze it. But this week I want to say that there are these different components of conflict. You're going to find that in this week's readings. But there are different ways of looking at conflict. As destructive as conflict can be, and really, isn't that a lot of what we're talking about? We looked at Bullard's stages or phases of conflict last week, and with that, we saw how every congregation has conflict. Every relationship has some sort of conflict. The question is, how do you deal with that conflict? How do you work with that conflict? How do you work through that conflict, or don't you? So we've got that part of conflict, but I think the reason we're taking this course is either because you have to as part of your studies, or because you're in a conflicted congregation. You're in the midst of what really is destructive or has the great potential of being destructive conflict. So with that, the question is, what are those components? What are the reasons now for that conflict? Well, okay, so where I started before I went on that little diatribe was that conflict, as destructive as it can be, really is functional in some way. If it wasn't in some way functioning, if it wasn't in some way benefiting people, or at least people thinking it's benefiting, and I would be willing to argue that in some way, even in the midst of it, and as angry and upset and awful as people are and are feeling within the confines of that conflict, they or someone is benefiting from it. And maybe even both sides, because one side is benefiting from it because they think they're going to have the power or whatever. But then again, I think that the other side must feel the same way. Otherwise, they would walk away from it for some reason. So again, some way, somehow, conflict is benefiting. It has a function, and it's functioning no matter how destructive that functioning and function is, or those functions are. There's that functional way of analyzing conflict. Who's benefiting? What is, not so much what is this about, in a way it is what's this about underlying there. Another way of looking at conflict is the competition. Who's competing, but more importantly, for what are they competing? You can send somebody out, but they're really only scapegoats, right? Because as soon as you blame a conflict on somebody when they leave, there's going to be the next person that you're going to believe. Conflict isn't about people. Ultimately, it's about the system. We can look at it from a systems analysis, particularly family systems. That's a very popular way of looking at conflict. Who are the families? Who do different people within that matrix of conflict? Who's playing out what? And it gets really complicated when you're in a congregation that has a key family and they're playing out their family dynamics. I pastored a church like that, where the man who was the board chair kept saying, we can't make a smaller board. We can't do this because people like my mother come in and they try to take over the board. We have to have more people on the board. And we were able to reduce the board ever so slightly by maybe 2 or 3 people. And this man talked about his mother, no lie, literally as a bitch, and his mother had left in her bitchiness a few years ago, had left and was going to another church, but through some not liking what was going on in that church and not having any more power in that church, then ended up coming back to this church, and now this bitch mom was, wow, mom's back. And people who had fought for what had become the future, the pieces that had become the future of that church, now have that conflict back. The conflictual pieces, so many of those dynamics had changed, but they really hadn't. And so the son held on to ways, his thinking was so affected, if you will, because of those dynamics, not just about the church's dynamics, but his mother's dynamic. And within 2 months after the return of that mother and father, the whole tenor of board meetings changed. It got ugly again. Key people left the church. And for me, I said, wow, I was only there part-time in a transitional place, and it wasn't worth the fight or the headaches or the health challenges any longer there. So, and when I say health challenges, I'm talking about literally headaches and just stress that was playing out in me because of some of those dynamics and the way those dynamics affected me as well. So yeah, there were some mass exodi, you might want to say, from that congregation. Was it that person who left, was everything rosy because of that? No, but there were structures in the church that had allowed for that behavior. And it wasn't perhaps so much that that person returned, it's that that structure hadn't actually been able to switch and to be in place. And what the son thought was having more people on the board being able to counter that, that really wasn't what that church needed. It needed to codify the leadership and the leadership struggle that, or the leadership structure, that's what I meant. They needed to complete the codification of that leadership structure that would have been sound, that would have been strong, challenged, yes, with the return of that person or the entry of any person who brought those kind of dynamics in with them. But the church was caught up in its own stuff that far preceded that family, that didn't allow it to go forward, to do what it needed to do. And instead of moving forward, instead of we never complete our transition processes, but instead of taking those next steps and to carry on what was happening and with the new members and the programs that were unfolding and whatnot, instead of being able to focus everything on that, now all of a sudden it began to refocus on the conflict. And people start to leave again, and the growth that had been seen in the congregation was then pushed completely back to where it had been even earlier. So, okay, that's this whole piece to talk about another way of looking at conflict and some of the components, family systems, ways of looking, who's benefiting, who's not, not only family-wise, but we play roles within the congregation in those ways. Another way of looking at it is resources. There's competition, conflict, right? Competition, competing views, ideas, thoughts, wants, needs. And so then you've got resources. You have to make decisions. Do we put more money in the building, or do we put more money into programs? If we're going to choose building, how do we maximize our building? If we're choosing programs, for which programs will we put that money into first, right? Resources. Let's see, another one. I'm over here looking at my notes as you see my eyes over to the side. There's conflict that arises because of growth. Again, there's some power dynamics in there, changing over who has power, who doesn't have power. There's growth, there's decline. Oh my goodness, there's the fear that comes around there. There is that power. Who has power? Who doesn't have power? Who's having to relinquish power? Who grabs the power when people not only relinquish it, but when people die or otherwise go away? We see conflict around that change. And one of the dynamics with change is that people, I am finding, as the church changes, aging people, aging members get really uptight. It's not always about power, and it's not always necessarily about resources, but often it's about, here's what's comfortable to me. This is how I've always done this. I come in, I say a litany in worship, I sing this hymn, I've got communion at this part or this part, the sermon lasts this long. And we often, those of us that do congregational transitions, we look at all of this and we say, okay, some people say, oh my gosh, it's not about the litanies, oh my gosh, it's not about the worship or the worship style, or what do you mean you want a 10-minute sermon? Really, that the length of that. Well, what I found is that what people equate church with God. And so if church is God, and this is the way church is, that litany, that hymn, that prayer, that this, it has that role. If that's what God is, in a way, I mean, it becomes a God, right? But if we equate God with worship service in church, and then that changes, then what does that say about an ever-changing God? It really is ever changing, right? But what does that say? And now I'm aging, or I've got physical illness or issues. My friends do, my family. I'm facing terminal illness, either in myself or my immediate family or my family, my friends. I read the obituaries, and all that's very real. What about my mortal soul? What about all these promises? What about this promise of eternity, about God being ever present, all loving, and steadfast and sure? And now I can't really rely on God. So what does that say about my eternity and my eternal life? Change is a big one to bring up conflict. We will fight against change. And it may not be the I like, I want. We express it that way because that's how we know to express things. And we can say that's not healthy, blah, blah, blah. But we don't have the tools, and we don't have the words, and we don't know how and when to say. I mean, what is the appropriate time to say? I think what your real challenge is, that you're afraid God may not be there for you. And part of that is we haven't taught or known to taught or don't know ourselves. We haven't been taught spiritual practices that have put us into relationship with God and with Jesus, over and in addition to, maybe, I don't know if the term I want to use is over and against a relationship with the church, right? We don't see God. We don't really understand Jesus because the church is that for us. And it has been for generations, decades, generations, I'm apt to say. So conflict is often fear-driven. That's one of the fear-driven, power-driven. It's need-driven. Some of you, many of you are familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. This is this hierarchy that leads to what Maslow would call self-actualization. You have to have your basic needs met. You have to have, clean air, food, water, and then there's safety and security. What I'm going to give to you, I will put up on the boards, is is what I call the Tenny-Brittian hierarchy of needs, and it's applying Maslow's hierarchy to congregations. And you can see how if a congregation is going to do what God has created them to do, right? If they're going to fulfill God's mission for them, and if they're going to fulfill what Jesus needs them to do, that vision that Jesus has given them for this place and time, if they're going to do that, these parts have to be in place, right? They have to have, well, you'll see it. You'll see it on the chart. So it's the Tenny-Brittian hierarchy of needs. It's up there. It's posted with your resources, and in that hierarchy, you can begin to analyze your conflict as to what level your congregation's stuck on. And of course, it's about the people who are coming in. It's very much related to your community. If you're in a rural community, say, that's had a horrific fire or some other disaster, where if you're in a community, a small community, very tight-knit community, and someone in the, one of the youth, the children, a teacher, somebody who's somehow known, or one of your public service folks, a policeman or fireman, has died, perhaps not even in the line of service, of duty, if that's happened, or when that happens, you will see it affect a whole church. And when it affects the whole church, it affects the or the whole community, and then it affects the congregations. I see this a lot too, where businesses close in small congregations or in neighborhoods that are dependent on that business, or factory. What do they do? What do they do now? People in the community are out of church or out of jobs, which means that people in your church are out of jobs. I'm thinking of a congregation that I worked with a number of years ago, and they had the smallest Walmart. This is before those little come and go Walmart, whatever they're called these days. But of all the Walmarts that had been built up until that time, of these little Walmarts, they had the smallest one. And they built a super Walmart about 8, maybe 10 miles out of town in this other little community, up and coming community in its own rural way. And that put people out. They closed then the smallest one, which made the headlines because the smallest Walmart was closing. I'm thinking the article said this many people lost their jobs. A number of those people were in the churches, so now they don't have the income in their hierarchy, their income, how they're going to buy food, where they're going to get jobs in a dying town where there are no jobs, really. What they're going to do about that. They without a job, not only they're not jobs, but the jobs that are closer in, they have to compete for those, and they may not have had the education or the training to get more professional jobs where they could make the money that they'd been making while working at the Walmart. But those are individuals, but as a community, they had lost one of the cornerstones of their community, and not even Walmart for them. One of the last bastions of business and commerce in that town, not even the Walmart wanted them anymore. So it wasn't just about individuals being out of town or out of work. It was about, in a way, it was a sense of pride, but it was part of their community. And their community left them the way people had been leaving out of that community for years. There's a lot of conflict in that congregation, a lot of conflict in that congregation, and so much of it was fear-based. So you get fear, you get power, you get competition for resources, you get dynamics of change. These are components of conflict. You're going to read a bit more about those this week. We're going to have some discussion about that on the discussion boards. As always, I look forward to seeing you on there. Appreciate you very, very much. Your honesty and your willingness to put yourselves out there. For that, I'm really grateful and continue to be really grateful for getting to be your instructor. All right, it's going to be another great week. Take care. Bye-bye.